Okay, moving on to intentional torts. Battery is an intentional tort. The defendant is liable for battery when he causes a harmful or offensive contact with the person of another and acts with intent to cause such contact. Oh yeah, Michigan is a comparative um, comparative negligence state. It's a comparative negligence state, and it also is a modified comparative negligence state. So if you're more than 50% responsible, so if you're 51% or more responsible for an accident or an injury that occurred to you, you can collect non-economic damages like pain and suffering, etc., but you are not entitled to economic damages. So anyway, battery requires intent and harmful or offensive contact when you're talking about torts. The item could be connected to you, and if the item is connected to you, the facts will tell you regarding the MBE. Assault requires intent and reasonable apprehension of an imminent battery. So imminent means that there cannot be a significant delay. The example given was 10 minutes. You were threatened with harm if you didn't leave within 10 minutes. 10 minutes is not enough time to be considered imminent. Another intentional tort is trespass to chattel. What is chattel? Chattel is an item of property other than real estate. So trespass to chattel occurs when there is intentional interference with the use of personal property, and the remedy for this is actual damages. Now, trespass to chattel has nothing to do with conversion. The answer choices may ask you about conversion, and that answer is wrong. That is to confuse you. Conversion involves the intentional act which substantially interferes with the use so that the person converts it as their own. And the remedy for that is the value of property of the conversion. So basically, if I take your pen, use it for 2 hours, the remedy for that is just the ink because I gave you your pen back. So that's a trespass to chattel. That's an interference with the use of personal property. If I take your pen and snap it in half, that is now conversion because I converted it as my own, can't give it back to you, and now I owe you the value of the property at the point in which I broke it. So that's what I owe to you. Trespass to chattel is intentional interference with the use of personal property, and the remedy is actual damages. Conversion is the intentional act with which substantially interferes with the use so that I convert it as my own, and the remedy for that is value of property I convert. Trespass to land. Trespass to land is the intentional entering the land of another, and it requires physical invasion. Trespass to land. Intentionally physically entering the land of another. No damage has to occur to the property for a person to be liable for trespassing to land. Okay, intentional infliction of emotional distress requires intent or recklessness. Number 2, extreme and outrageous conduct. And 3, severe emotional distress. The bystander rule for IIED is that it must be a close family member. Defendant had knowledge that you were the family member, and it must have caused severe emotional distress. For non-family members, the bystander must suffer physical harm. So all of the above plus the physical harm, and they must be in the zone of danger as well. All right, moving on. False imprisonment. False imprisonment is intentionally confining a person to a bounded area, and that person must be aware of the confinement. So 1, intent; 2, confined by bounded area; and 3, aware of the confinement. Private citizen confinement is privileged when 1, a felony occurs, and 2, the citizen reasonably suspects that the person can find committed the felony. Shopkeeper's privilege is where there's reasonable belief that a person detained committed a crime and the detainment is reasonable and it's for a reasonable period of time. So one, shopkeeper's privilege, reasonable belief, detained in a reasonable manner, reasonable period of time. One, reasonable belief. Two, detained in a reasonable manner. Three, reasonable period of time. Okay, we're going to move to negligent versions of intentional torts. Negligent trespass to land. You're liable if you negligently enter the land of another, and you're liable for damage to the land. For example, texting and driving, swerve onto the land. You were being negligent when you were texting and driving, so whatever damage your car does to the land, you are responsible for. Okay, negligent infliction of emotional distress. One, requires negligent conduct. Two, must be in the zone of danger. And three, severe emotional distress and physical harm must occur. Driving and texting and a car almost hits you, you jump out of the way and break your leg. You have severe emotional distress, physical harm, you're in a zone of danger, and the person driving and texting was negligent. So negligent, IED, requires negligent conduct. You must be in a zone of danger. You must suffer severe emotional distress and physical harm. The bystander rule for NIED is that it must be a close family member. Emotional distress must occur. Okay, and then there's this weird one that deals with mishandling of a corpse. And one, you must negligently handle the corpse. No physical harm is required. And then, of course, there's transferred intent. Whenever a defendant intends to commit a tort but commits a different tort or the same tort against another person, that transfer intent applies, and it must be assault, battery, false imprisonment, trespass to land, or trespass to chattel. One of the five: assault, battery, false imprisonment, trespass to land, trespass to chattel. ABFTT. ABFTT. Okay, let's talk about some defenses to intentional torts. One is consent, and that might be implied or expressed and cannot exceed the scope of consent. So if I tell you to slap me in the face and you punch me in the face, that's exceeding the scope of consent. Another example would be you're playing a ball game and pushing each other around. It's kind of implied consent. You don't really expressly consent to it, but those are things that occur in a ball game. So if you're playing a sport that you normally push and shove each other around, but someone uses like brass knuckles to knock you out, that does exceed the scope of the implied consent. Another defense is self-defense. And that requires that there's a reasonable belief of attack and you must use reasonable force. So if someone comes at you with a feather or a pin, you can't hit me with a bat. Another defense is defense of others, and that requires that you reasonably believe the third party is being attacked. Defense of property requires reasonable force, reasonable belief to stop invasion of land, and cannot use deadly force to defend property. So 3 elements: reasonable force, reasonable belief to stop invasion of land, and 3, cannot use deadly force to defend property. Okay, then we have the necessities: private necessity and public necessity. Private necessity is a defense to trespass, and you're liable for damages to property. If you're flying a plane and the plane is about to crash, so you land on someone else's piece of land to avoid crashing, that is a private necessity, and you're still liable for damages. Public necessity is when you're preventing public harm and you're not liable to damages to the property. And then you can only use deadly force to defend property if there is a threat to personal safety. Okay, to wrap this up, the intentional torts are assault, battery, false imprisonment, trespass to land, trespass to chattel. Defenses to intentional torts are consent, self-defense, defense of others, defense of property, private necessity, and public necessity.